The solicitor's clerk set the folded paper on the table between them, and Margaret Fenwick did not look at it. She looked instead at the window, where the last of the autumn light was failing over the square. And she thought, not for the first time, that a piece of parchment could hold a man's whole life inside 4 folded corners and never once ask his permission. 3 streets away, in a drawing room hung with portraits of ancestors who had never once needed to count their coin, Julian Ashford, Earl of Cravenmore, stood very still while his aunt told him whom he would marry. "The Fenwick girl," said Lady Beatrice Ashford, turning a ring upon her finger, as though the matter were already settled, as in her mind it plainly was. Her father left her £30,000, and no relations of consequence to spend it on her behalf. It is, I grant you, trade money, yet it spends the same as any other, and Cravenmore is not in a position to be particular. Julian said nothing for a long moment. Beyond the window, a rook crossed the gray sky, unhurried, indifferent to the house and its debts. "Trade money," he repeated at last, and something in his voice made his aunt glance up. "You say it as though it were an insult, and a solution in the same breath." "It is both," said Lady Beatrice. "That is rather the point of trade money, Julian." He did not answer her. He was thinking, as he had thought every day for 3 years, of the letter that had come the winter his father died, informing him in a clerk's careful hand that Cravenmore's mortgage had passed, upon the death of the original holder, into the possession of an unnamed party represented by a city solicitor, and that the terms of repayment remained, for the present, unchanged. He had never learned the creditor's name. He had only learned to live with the knowledge that his own house did not, in the strictest sense, belong to him, and that somewhere in London a stranger held the paper that could take it away with a single instruction to a clerk. He had told himself that a wealthy marriage would end it. He had not told himself that the woman he married might be sitting, at that very hour, in a solicitor's office 3 streets away, holding the very deed in question in her gloved and steady hands. Margaret had known, of course, exactly what she held, since the morning 8 months before when her father's will had been read, and the mortgage on Cravenmore had passed to her along with the rest of his city fortune, a fortune built patiently and without apology on loans other gentlemen had been too proud to ask for anywhere else. She had known it the way one knows a scar beneath a glove, present, unremarked upon, never quite forgotten. Her father had liked the old Earl, the current one's father, liked him the way a careful man sometimes likes a reckless one, with exasperation and a strange loyalty both. He had never called in the debt while the old man lived. Margaret had continued not calling it in since his death, for reasons she had not entirely examined, and would not have called them mercy if asked, though mercy was very near the truth of it. "You will call on Lord Cravenmore on Thursday," her aunt informed her now, folding her hands with the satisfaction of a woman who had, after considerable effort, arranged a match no one else had thought to attempt. "He is proud, and he is poor, and you are neither too plain nor too clever to manage him. It wants only your consent. He does not know what I hold," Margaret said quietly. "He knows what your father left you. That is all that concerns him." "It is not all that concerns me," said Margaret, and did not explain herself further, because there was no explaining, in her aunt's hearing, why a woman would keep silent about a fortune she could have used to humble a proud man, except that she had never wished to humble him at all. She met him for the first time on the following Thursday, in a drawing-room grown shabby at its edges in the particular way of houses whose owners could no longer afford to hide their poverty behind fresh paint. He rose when she entered. He was tall, dark-haired. composed in the manner of a man who had learned composure as a discipline rather than inherited it as a temperament, and he looked at her for exactly as long as courtesy required, and not 1 moment longer. "Miss Fenwick," he said, and bowed, and she heard in the correctness of it a wall being built in real time, brick by careful brick, against the fact of what this meeting was for. "My lord," she answered, and curtsied, and thought absurdly of the folded paper in the solicitor's strong-box, and of how strange it was to stand in a poor man's drawing-room, holding, unseen, the entire weight of his house. Lady Beatrice arranged them at the tea-table with the brisk satisfaction of a general placing troops, and the conversation that followed was the conversation of 2 people conducting a transaction while pretending, for the sake of the room, that it was something else. He asked after her father's business with the careful neutrality of a man asking after a subject he found faintly distasteful, and knew he could not afford to show it. She answered him plainly, without apology, because apologizing for her father's trade had never once occurred to her as a thing worth doing. "You do not seem ashamed of it," he observed, and there was something in his tone that was not quite contempt, though it stood near enough to touch it. "Should I be?" she asked. "My father was honest in his dealings, which is more than can be said of every man who calls himself a gentleman." For a moment something moved behind his eyes, quick and startled, gone before she could be certain she had seen it at all. He did not answer her. He only looked at her a fraction longer than before, and then looked away, as a man looks away from a fire he has been told not to feel the warmth of. She left an hour later with a second call arranged for the following week, and with the particular unsettled feeling of having been measured by a man who did not yet know what she was worth, in every sense that mattered, and who would like her a good deal less, she suspected, the day he found out. The second call took place a week later, in the same drawing-room, though this time Julian's aunt had contrived to leave them briefly alone under the pretext of ordering fresh tea, a pretext so thin that Margaret nearly smiled at it. "You are wondering," Julian said once the door had closed, "why a man who has met you twice is already speaking to solicitors about settlements." "I had wondered," she admitted. "Cravenmore carries a debt," he said, and the words came out of him with the flat, controlled precision of a confession, long rehearsed, and never once delivered aloud. "A mortgage, taken by my father, held now by some city creditor, whose name I have never been permitted to learn. I intend to marry money enough to end it. I will not pretend otherwise to you, Miss Fenwick, whatever else I might pretend to the rest of the room." She was quiet for a moment, turning her teacup a half-turn on its saucer, thinking of the paper in the strong-box, and of how easy it would be, in this exact instant, to end the whole uncertain architecture of the thing by simply telling him the truth. She did not tell him. She would examine that silence many times in the weeks that followed, and would never entirely forgive herself for it, though she would come eventually to understand it. "That is honest of you," she said instead. "It is practical of me," he said. "I have found that honesty and practicality tend, in my situation, to be the same virtue wearing 2 coats. And what does the situation require of me?" she asked. "Beyond the £30,000. Something in his face shifted, briefly, at the bluntness of it, the way a man's face shifts when he is braced for an accusation and received instead a plain question. "Nothing beyond civility," he said. "I do not ask you to love Cravenmore. I ask only that you be willing to live in it." "I could manage civility," she said, and there was, beneath the dryness of it, something almost like relief, that he had not tried to dress the transaction in finer clothes than it wore. It was in the 3rd week, at a small dinner given by his aunt to display the match to the neighborhood before it was properly announced, that Margaret first heard the label spoken aloud, in the particular hushed register reserved for things one says believing the subject of them cannot hear. "The sight's daughter," murmured Lady Harriet Sinclair to her mother, behind a fan lifted a half-inch too late, in the alcove nearest the window where Margaret had gone to escape the heat of the fire. "One does wonder what Lord Cravenmore is thinking, though I suppose we all know precisely what he is thinking. Trade money spends the same in a mortgage as it does anywhere else." Margaret did not turn. She had heard worse said more openly, in rooms less careful of their manners, and she had long ago trained her spine not to answer such remarks with anything but stillness. The word trade, said in Lady Harriet's cool, unhurried voice, settled into her somewhere it had not settled before, because this time it was said in the house she was soon to call her own, by a woman who would sit across from her at every dinner for the rest of her life if the marriage went forward. She composed her face and returned to the table, and if Julian, 3 seats down, noticed the particular careful blankness with which she resumed her seat, he gave no sign of it that evening. She did not know, then, that he had noticed everything, and filed it away, and said nothing only because he had not yet found the words that would not sound like pity. It was 2 days after that dinner that Margaret first witnessed the thing in him that made her silence, already uneasy, begin to feel like something closer to a wound of her own making. She had gone, without invitation, to the small tenant cottage at the edge of the Cravenmore home farm, having heard from her maid, who had heard it from a laundress, that the Hollis family owed 3/4 rent and faced removal before the month was out. She had brought nothing with her but a basket of bread and a folded note containing more money than the Hollis family had likely held at one time in their lives, and she had meant to leave both quietly at the door and be gone before anyone thought to thank her. She had not expected to find the Earl of Cravenmore already there before her, coatless in the cold, mending a section of fallen fence with his own hands, while old Hollis stood by, apologizing for a debt the man plainly could not pay. "Leave the fence, my lord," Hollis was saying, wretched with shame. "It is not fitting work for you." "It is precisely the fitting work," Julian said, not looking up from the post he was setting. "For a landlord who cannot yet offer his tenant anything more useful than his own 2 hands. He drove the post into the earth with a final, decisive blow. "Consider the quarter's rent forgiven, Hollis. We will speak of the rest in the spring, when the accounts are less unkind to both of us." Margaret stood at the edge of the yard, unseen, the basket heavy in her hands, and watched a man she had believed to be nothing more than a proud fortune hunter kneel in the mud of a tenant's yard and mend, with his own labor, a fence that would earn him nothing and cost him an afternoon he could ill afford to spare. She left the basket at the gate without announcing herself, and walked home slowly, turning over in her mind the uncomfortable, unwelcome fact that the man she had agreed to marry for the sake of a debt he did not know she held was, beneath the careful coldness he wore in drawing rooms, a better man than the coldness let anyone see. That evening, alone in her room, she took the folded deed from the small locked box where she kept it and read it through for perhaps the 20th time, as though the words might have rearranged themselves into something easier to carry. They had not. She was still, whatever her private feelings, the woman who held the paper that could ruin him, and she had still told him nothing. And the longer she said nothing, the more the silence itself began to feel less like discretion and more like a debt of its own, quietly accruing interest she was no longer certain she could afford to repay. If you have ever kept a single true thing unspoken out of a fear you could not quite name, you already understand what kept Margaret's silence in place through that autumn, long after the moment for easy honesty had passed. Stay with her a while longer. The reckoning, when it came, would not be the one either of them expected. The banns were read for the first time on a Sunday, made gray by early winter rain, and Margaret stood in the Craven-Moore family pew beside Lady Beatrice, and felt the whole church's collective attention settle upon her like a hand laid flat between her shoulder blades. Julian had not sat beside her. He sat, as convention required before the marriage, with the men of his family 2 rows distant, and she was left to endure the service under his aunt's watchful correction, and the frank, assessing stares of a congregation that had known the Ashford name for 3 centuries and was still deciding what to make of the woman who would soon carry it. Afterward, in the churchyard, while the rain held off long enough for the parish to exchange its Sunday courtesies, she heard the label a second time, spoken not in a murmur behind a fan, but in the open, unguarded manner of a woman who did not much care who overheard her. "I do think it a shame," said Lady Beatrice to a cluster of her particular friends, not troubling to lower her voice as Margaret approached from the Lychgate, "that the Ashford name must be mended with trade money. Yet there it is. A Sight's daughter's coin closes a gap as neatly as any other, and Craven-Moore cannot afford to be sentimental about the source of a debt's discharge." The women around her murmured their agreement, the particular soft murmur of people confirming an opinion they had already held before it was offered to them, and Margaret, arriving within clear earshot, saw several faces turn toward her with the swift, unashamed curiosity of people wondering whether she had heard. She had heard. She inclined her head to Lady Beatrice with perfect courtesy, said something pleasant and entirely forgettable about the coldness of the morning, and walked on toward the carriage with her spine very straight, because she had decided, long before this moment, that she would not give this particular room the satisfaction of watching her flinch. Julian, crossing the churchyard from the opposite direction, had heard every word of it. He said nothing to his aunt. He came instead directly to Margaret's side, offered his arm without asking whether she wished for it, which she noted even then was not quite the same as commanding her, and said only, low enough that it did not carry, "Walk with me to the carriage. The ground is treacherous near the wall." The ground was not, in fact, especially treacherous. She understood, taking his arm, that this was not a remark about the ground at all, but the nearest thing to comfort a man like Julian Ashford knew how to offer in a churchyard full of watching eyes. A plain, practical instruction that asked nothing of her and gave her, all the same, somewhere steady to stand. "Your aunt does not think highly of my father's trade," she said, once they were far enough from the crowd that the words could be private. "My aunt," he said, "has opinions about a great many things she has never once had to survive on her own resources. I would not weight them too heavily." He paused at the carriage door, and for a moment his composure slipped just enough that she saw, beneath it, something that looked almost like apology, though he did not offer the word itself. "You did not deserve that. I am aware, Miss Fenwick, that I have brought you into a house that will not always be kind to you, for reasons that have nothing to do with your own worth." It was the closest he had come, in 6 weeks of careful transactional courtesy, to saying anything that was not strictly necessary, and Margaret felt the words land somewhere beneath her composure, in the place where her own carefully guarded silence about the deed sat like a stone she had swallowed and could not bring back up. "You are kinder than you let the room believe," she said. "The room does not require my kindness," he said. "It requires my solvency. The two are rarely called for at the same hour." He handed her into the carriage, and as her glove brushed his bare hand in the doing of it, she felt the small, betraying warmth rise in her face before she could master it, and saw, in the half-second before he stepped back, that he had felt something answer it in himself, quickly suppressed, quickly turned away from, as a man turns from a fire he has told himself he cannot afford to feed. Neither of them spoke of it again that day, Yet something between them had shifted its footing, quietly, the way earth shifts beneath a house long before anyone above it notices the first hairline crack in the plaster. And Margaret rode home, turning the deed over in her mind once more, and thinking, with a dread that had nothing to do with money, that she had waited too long to tell him the truth, and that every week she waited now made the eventual telling harder, rather than easier to survive. The wedding took place a fortnight later, in the same church, before a congregation considerably larger than the one that had watched the banns read. And if the ceremony itself was solemn rather than joyful, conducted between two people who had agreed to marry for reasons neither of them called love, there was, in the moment Julian took her hand before the altar, a steadiness in his grip that felt, to Margaret, like something more than the discharge of a bargain. She did not yet know what he carried beneath that steadiness. She would learn it soon enough, in a room with the curtains drawn against the winter light. And it would change, in ways neither of them could yet foresee. Everything she believed she understood about the man she had married. The wound revealed itself 3 weeks into the marriage, on an evening when a late storm kept them both indoors, and Julian, uncharacteristically, poured a second glass of brandy before the library fire and did not immediately retreat behind the newspaper that had become, in their short married life, his customary shield against conversation. "My father was not a wicked man," he said, without preamble, staring into the fire rather than at her. "I want that understood before I say anything further. He was reckless and proud, and he mortgaged this house to cover debts he was too ashamed to name even to his own solicitor. And he did it, I believe, because he could not bear to be the Ashford who let the name shrink in his own lifetime. He would rather borrow against the future than admit the present had already failed him." Margaret set down her needlework and said nothing, sensing correctly that the smallest interruption might close the door he had, for the first time, begun to open. "I did not know the extent of it until he was dead," Julian went on. "I found the papers in his desk 3 days after the funeral, and I have spent every year since trying to discover who holds the debt, so that I might at least know the shape of the thing threatening us, and I have never once succeeded. Whoever holds it has kept themselves entirely hidden behind a city solicitor, and I have come to imagine them, I confess, as something considerably crueler than I suspect they actually are." He turned the glass in his hand. "I married you, Margaret, believing your fortune would let me buy the debt back before that unknown creditor ever chose to call it in and take the house from beneath us both. I did not marry you to love you. I want you to know that I understand how little that costs me to say, and how much it may have cost you to hear." "You believe you failed him," Margaret said quietly. "Your father." Something crossed his face, quick and unguarded, the first true crack she had seen in 6 weeks of careful composure. "I was in London the winter he died. I had written to him twice about the state of the accounts, and both times he wrote back that all was managed, and I believed him, because it was easier than pressing further. I did not come home until the funeral. If I had come sooner, I have often thought I might have found the papers in time to do something other than inherit the ruin whole." He said it flatly, without self-pity, the way a man states an old wound he has long since stopped expecting anyone to dress. "I have not told anyone that. My aunt believes I was detained by business. It was easier to let her believe it." Margaret rose, crossed the small distance between them, and did not touch him, though she wanted to, and said instead the only thing she could offer that was not pity, dressed as comfort. "A son cannot manage a father, determined to hide his own ruin from him. You did not fail him. He failed to let himself be helped." He looked at her then, with an expression she had not yet seen him wear, something unguarded and almost startled, as though she had said aloud a thing he had needed permission to believe, and had never once been offered it. "You are the first person who has said that to me," he said, and made it sound like something other than flattery. "If you have ever carried a grief you were certain was your own fault, and needed only one honest voice to tell you otherwise, you will understand exactly what passed between them in that firelit room. It cost her nothing to say it. It very nearly undid him to hear it." He rose, then, and crossed to the small writing desk beneath the window, and drew from its bottom drawer a single iron key, worn smooth with age, which he turned once between his fingers before setting it upon the mantel, rather than offering it to her outright. "My mother kept a walled garden on the east side of the house," he said. "Roses, mostly, and a stone bench where she used to sit with your father. In fact, in the summers before either of you were born. She let the debt take her spirit long before it took the accounts, and I have kept the garden locked since her death, because I could not bear to see it gone to ruin, and could not spare the hands to keep it living. I do not know why I am telling you this tonight, except that it seems, suddenly, a foolish thing to keep locked for its own sake." They did not speak further of the debt that night, yet something in the room had loosened, the particular loosening that happens when a locked door, however briefly, stands open, and Margaret climbed the stairs an hour later, carrying, along with her candle, the full, unbearable weight of the truth she had still not told him, made heavier now by every honest word he had just given her, for nothing in return. She resolved, that night, that she would tell him before the month was out. She would come to wish, bitterly, that she had resolved it 3 weeks sooner, before anyone else in the household had the chance to discover the truth ahead of her, and deliver it to him stripped of every mitigating word she might have offered alongside it. The discovery, when it came through no fault of Margaret's own carelessness, but through the ordinary mechanism of a solicitor's clerk who mentioned, in idle conversation with a colleague at his club, the curious coincidence of a Fenwick mortgage on a Cravenmore estate, and a friend of Lady Beatrice's who happened, by pure ill fortune, to be dining at that same club that evening. Lady Beatrice arrived at Cravenmore 2 days later, in a state of controlled fury Margaret had not yet seen her wear, and summoned her to the morning room with a note so curt it might have been an order to a servant, rather than a request to her nephew's wife. "You have known," Lady Beatrice said, without preamble, the moment the door had closed, "since before your wedding day, that your family held the mortgage on this house. You married my nephew for love of his title, while holding, all the while, the very paper that could take it from him. I confess I do not know whether to call that ambition or something considerably uglier. I did not seek the debt," Margaret said. "I inherited it, along with everything else my father left me. I have called in nothing. I have demanded nothing. I intended, when the time was right, to release it to Julian as a gift, quietly, without ceremony, and I would still do so today. This hour, if you would allow me to explain it to him myself before you carry it to him, twist it into something it was never meant to be." "How convenient," said Lady Beatrice, "that your generosity has waited 8 months to declare itself, and only now, when discovery has made silence impossible. I wonder whether a woman who wished truly to give a gift would not have given it the day the wedding lines were signed, rather than holding it, quiet-wise, like a card kept close at a table she had not yet decided whether to win." She was gone from the room before Margaret could answer her, moving with the swift, satisfied purpose of a woman carrying news she intended to deliver herself, in her own words, before anyone else's account could soften it. Margaret found Julian an hour later in the estate office, standing very still with a letter in his hand that she recognized, even from the doorway, as his aunt's close, decisive script. "Is it true," he said without turning, "that the mortgage on this house has been in your family's keeping since before we ever met." "It is true," Margaret said, and did not attempt to soften the word, because she had already learned, in the churchyard and the drawing room, and now in this cold office with the fire unlit, that softening the truth had never once made it easier to hear, only easier to distrust. "You said nothing," he said. "6 weeks of courtship, a wedding, weeks of marriage since. You sat in this house, in my confidence, and let me speak to you of a debt I believed was owed to some faceless stranger in the city, while the stranger sat across from me at my own dinner table. I meant to release it to you," she said. "I meant it from before we were wed. I did not know how to say it without you believing precisely what your aunt now believes, that I held it over you deliberately, as a lever. And I was afraid, I confess it plainly, that the moment I told you, you would never again be able to look at anything I did or said without wondering what I wanted from it. And instead," he said, turning to face her at last, his voice very level and very cold, the voice she had not heard from him since their first meeting in his aunt's shabby drawing room. "I discovered it from a woman who has wished us ill from the first week of our engagement, in a letter that arrived before you thought to tell me yourself. You have made certain, Margaret, that whatever explanation you now offer me arrives already poisoned. That was never my intention." "Intention," he said, "is a fine thing to plead after the fact. I asked one thing of this marriage, not love. I never asked that of you. I asked only that whatever else passed between us, I would not be made a fool of in my own house." He set his aunt's letter down upon the desk with a care that was somehow worse than if he had thrown it. "I find I no longer know whether that was too much to ask." He left her standing alone in the cold office, and Margaret did not follow him, because she understood, with the particular clarity that comes only after the worst has already happened, that nothing she said in that moment would reach him, and that the only honest thing left to do was to let the silence she had kept for 8 months finally cost her exactly what it had always threatened to cost, and to bear it without flinching, as she had borne every other unkind word said of her since the day she came to Cravenmore. For a week Julian did not seek her out, and Margaret did not seek him, and the house settled into the particular brittle quiet of 2 people moving carefully around each other's grief. It was Mrs. Dunmore, the old housekeeper who had served 3 generations of Ashfords, and had taken, from the first, a quiet liking to Margaret that survived even the household's general unease, who brought her the last of it on the morning before the county's assembly ball. "I did not wish to carry tales, my lady," Mrs. Dunmore said, twisting her apron in work-worn hands. "But I thought you ought to hear it from someone who means you well, rather than from someone who does not. Lady Beatrice was heard in the servants' hall last evening telling Mr. Price's clerk, who had called on some small business, that his lordship had married a Seite's daughter who had schemed for the match from the start, holding the mortgage back like a snare laid for a fool. She said it plain, my lady, not troubling to lower her voice for the maids, and I am afraid it will be halfway round the county by the time the assembly opens its doors tonight." Margaret thanked her, and sat a long while afterward with her hands folded in her lap, absorbing the fact that the label which had followed her in a murmur and then in the open air of a churchyard had now traveled all the way into her own servants' hall, carried by the mistress of the house she had married into, and that by evening it would be spoken, she did not doubt, by half the drawing rooms in the county. She went to the assembly, regardless. She had decided, somewhere in the quiet of that long week, that she would not give the county the satisfaction of watching her hide. The rooms were crowded and bright and unbearably loud, with the particular gaiety of people who had heard a delicious rumor and meant to enjoy watching its subject endure it. Margaret felt every eye in the room find her and hold a moment too long before sliding away, and heard, more than once, her own name folded into a sentence that stopped the instant she came within earshot of it. Lady Harriet, radiant in ice-blue silk, made a point of greeting her with exaggerated warmth that fooled no one, least of all Margaret, who understood precisely what performance was being staged for the benefit of the watching room. Julian arrived late and stood near the door for a long while, and did not come to her. And Margaret understood, watching him from across the crowded floor, that whatever had broken in the estate office a week before had not yet begun to mend, and might not mend at all, and that she had perhaps lost, through 8 months of well-intended silence, the one honest thing that had begun, however briefly, to grow between them. It was Lady Beatrice, moving through the crowd with the satisfied ease of a woman certain of her own triumph, who delivered the final blow, pausing beside a cluster of matrons close enough to Margaret that every word reached her plainly. "One almost pities her," Lady Beatrice said, fan lifted, voice pitched precisely to Carrie. "A Sight's daughter, clever enough to trap an earl with his own family's debt, and not clever enough to realize that cleverness of that kind never buys a woman what she actually wants. She may hold the deed to Cravenmore. She will never hold its regard." The room's attention turned, as one body, to see how Margaret would answer it, and for a long, suspended moment, she felt the full weight of every eye in the assembly settle upon her at once, waiting to see whether she would break. She did not break. She set down her glass with a hand that did not shake, though it cost her everything to keep it steady, and walked from the room without a word, out into the cold entrance hall, past footmen who would not meet her eyes, and stood alone beneath the great unlit chandelier, thinking that she had borne every unkindness this county had offered her since the day of her arrival, and had never once, until this moment, believed herself entirely without hope of enduring it. She did not see Julian cross the ballroom floor behind her. She did not see his face, white with a fury that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with his aunt, or the way his hand closed briefly, hard, upon the doorframe before he followed her out into the night. "Margaret!" She turned at the sound of her name in his voice, low and urgent in the empty hall, and found him already crossing the marble toward her, his composure, for the first time since she had known him, entirely abandoned. "I have been a fool," he said before she could speak. "I have spent a week nursing my own wounded pride while my aunt carried her poison into every drawing room in the county, and I let her, because it was easier than admitting that my anger at you was never truly about the deed at all. It was about the fact that I had, against every intention I brought to this marriage, begun to care for you. And discovering the deed felt, in that first terrible hour, like discovering that even that had been managed for me, arranged, decided before I ever had the chance to choose it freely. I should have told you before the wedding," Margaret said. "I have known it every day since. I was afraid, and I let the fear cost us both something I cannot fully mend with an apology in an empty hall." "Then let us not mend it in an empty hall," Julian said, and took her hand. And there was nothing tentative left in the gesture, none of the careful courtesy of their early weeks. "Come back inside with me." "Julian, the room has already decided what it thinks of me. Nothing said in an empty corridor will change that." "No," he agreed. "Yet something said in front of the entire room might." He led her back through the great doors before she could protest further, and the ballroom's noise, which had continued in their absence with the particular relish of a room enjoying a scandal, faltered and then stopped entirely as the crowd registered the Earl of Cravenmore crossing the floor with his countess's hand held firmly in his own, his aunt's triumphant expression curdling in real time as she understood, a half-second before anyone else in the room did, exactly what was about to happen. He did not release Margaret's hand. He stopped at the center of the floor, in the exact spot where his aunt had delivered her final cruelty not 20 minutes before, and let the silence build around them, the whole room holding its breath, the way a room holds its breath before an announcement it has not yet been permitted to hear. "Margaret is my countess," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room without once rising into anything so undignified as a shout. "I will hear nothing said against her, in this house or any other, for as long as I live." The silence that followed lasted a long moment, long enough for Lady Beatrice's fan to still entirely in her hand, long enough for Lady Harriet Sinclair's carefully arranged smile to falter and fail, long enough for the room's collective understanding to shift, visibly, from scandal to something considerably closer to shame at having so recently enjoyed one. "Julian," Lady Beatrice began, recovering herself enough to attempt one final correction. "You cannot mean to overlook the manner in which she came to this house, holding a debt she never disclosed, arranging a marriage on terms she alone understood." "I mean precisely that," Julian said, turning to face his aunt directly, his voice quieter now, but no less final. "She held the deed to this house for 8 months and called in nothing. She could have ruined us the day she inherited it. And instead she waited, hoping to find a kind way to give it back. I have known men born to every advantage this family possesses who have shown less honor in a lifetime than she has shown in a single season of silence. She should never have had to keep alone." He looked briefly at Mr. Price's clerk, who had accompanied his employer to the assembly, and now stood near the refreshment table with the stricken expression of a man realizing his idle club gossip had traveled considerably further than he intended. "The mortgage on this house, I am given to understand, will be settled between my wife and myself as a private family matter, and I do not expect to hear it discussed again in any drawing room in this county." Lady Beatrice's mouth opened and closed once, twice, and no sound emerged from it. The particular silent collapse of a woman who has spent her authority on a single overreach and found, too late, that the room was no longer willing to extend her the credit of its agreement. Around the edges of the floor, faces that an hour before had leaned eagerly into every whispered cruelty now turned away from her, toward Margaret, with something that looked, unmistakably, like the beginning of respect. Margaret stood very still at Julian's side, her hand steady in his, and felt, for the first time since the folded paper had been set upon the solicitor's table so many months before, that the weight of it had finally, entirely, come to rest. Winter had softened into the first uncertain edge of spring by the time Julian took the old iron key down from the mantel, where it had sat untouched since the night he confessed his father's shame beside the library fire, and led Margaret across the frosted grass to the door in the east wall she had passed 100 times without ever once being permitted through it. The lock resisted at first, stiff with disuse, and then gave way beneath his hand with a groan of old iron, and the door swung inward upon a garden gone wild with a full winter's neglect. Brambles overtaking the beds, the stone bench nearly lost beneath a fall of dead leaves, and beneath all of it, unmistakably, the bones of something that had once been carefully, deliberately loved. "It wants a great deal of work," Julian said, standing in the doorway with the key still in his hand. "It wants an afternoon," Margaret said, already crouching beside the nearest bed to clear the leaves from a cluster of green shoots pushing stubbornly up through the cold soil. "And then it wants a season, and then it will want nothing at all but tending, which I find I do not mind giving it." He knelt beside her without being asked, and together they cleared the bed in a companionable quiet, that would have been unthinkable to either of them 5 months before, when she had stood in his aunt's shabby drawing room measuring a stranger's composure, and he had measured, in turn, the size of her fortune, and nothing more. The mortgage had been formally discharged a fortnight earlier, quietly, without ceremony, exactly as Margaret had once told his aunt she intended it. The folded deed burned in the library grate one quiet evening, while Julian held her hand, and neither of them said very much at all, because there had seemed, in the end, nothing left that needed saying about a debt that no longer stood between them. Lady Beatrice had removed to her sister's house in Bath within the month. Her authority in the household quietly and permanently ended, though Julian had insisted, over his aunt's own icy protest, that her allowance continue undiminished, because he had found, in the months since the assembly, that he preferred to correct rather than to punish, even those who had earned considerably worse than correction. Lady Harriet had married, that same spring, a baronet of unremarkable fortune, and had not, as far as anyone at Cravenmoor was aware, mentioned the name Fenwick again in company. Old Hollis's fence had held through the whole hard winter, and his rent, forgiven that autumn afternoon, had never once been mentioned between landlord and tenant again, though the old man had taken, since, to leaving a basket of the season's first apples at the kitchen door each year, a small, quiet gratitude neither grand nor explained. "My father used to say," Margaret said, brushing the dirt from her gloves as the last bed came clear beneath the pale spring sun, "that a debt honestly held was no shame to either side of it, only a thing waiting for the right season to be released. I did not understand him when he said it. I think I understand him now." "Your father," Julian said, taking the key from his pocket and pressing it, finally, into her open palm, closing her fingers around it with both of his own. "Sounds as though he was a wiser man than most of the ones this county has spent a season admiring instead." She looked down at the key, worn smooth in her hand, and then up at her husband, kneeling in the mud of a garden neither of them had been given, but both of them had chosen, together, to bring back to life, and felt, for the first time since a folded paper had been set upon a solicitor's table so many months before, that the whole uncertain weight of the past year had settled at last into something she no longer needed to carry alone. If Margaret and Julian's long season of silence and reckoning found its way to you tonight, I hope you will carry a little of their garden's second spring with you when you go. Thank you for staying until the very end. The roses came back that June, wild and unruly and entirely unplanned, exactly as Margaret had known, somehow, that they would. And on the warm evenings that followed, she and Julian took to sitting together on the old stone bench his mother had once shared with a city moneylender. Neither of their families had ever expected to matter, the garden gate standing open behind them, the key no longer needed to keep anyone out.